Some stories are best told slowly. So settle in, lower the lights, and let your thoughts drift as we go back to a quiet corner of England, to a stretch of countryside in Leicestershire, where three small villages sit close together, almost touching, divided only by footpaths and hedgerows and the soft folds of the land. Narborough, Enderby, Littlethorpe. These are the kinds of places where everyone knows everyone, where the same families have lived for generations, where a stranger walking down the lane is noticed and remembered. It is the sort of place that feels safe. And for a long time, it was. This is the story of how that quiet was broken, and of a discovery made in a university laboratory just a few miles away that would change criminal justice across the entire world. It is the story of the very first murder ever solved by something we now take for granted, something invisible, written into every cell of every living person. It is the story of Colin Pitchfork, and how, in the end, he was caught. You may have heard the outline of this already. Tonight, we will take our time with the whole of it. Let us begin gently, in the autumn of 1983. A 15-year-old girl named Linda Mann was making her way home one evening in November through the village of Narborough. She took a shortcut she had taken many times before, along a quiet footpath that the locals called the Black Pad. It was the kind of route every child in the village knew, a familiar trail between the hedges. But on that evening, Linda did not come home. The next morning, the 22nd of November, she was found along that path. She had been attacked and killed. She was just 15 years old, with her whole life still ahead of her. The police investigated, of course. They worked the case hard, but they had very little to go on. There were no useful witnesses, no obvious suspect, nothing that pointed clearly in any direction. In time, with sorrow and frustration, the inquiry went quiet. The villagers held their breath, and slowly, cautiously, life went on. Parents watched their children a little more closely. The shortcut along the Black Pad felt different now. But the years passed, and the sharp edge of fear softened, as it tends to do. And then it happened again. In the summer of 1986, nearly 3 years later, a second 15-year-old girl, Dawn Ashworth, set out through the neighboring village of Enderby. It was the 31st of July. Like Linda before her, she chose a familiar path, a route called 10-Pound Lane. Like Linda, she did not return home. 2 days later, on the 2nd of August, she too was found, in a wooded area near that lane. She had been killed in a way so similar to the first girl that the police felt, almost at once, a cold certainty settling over them. The same hand had done this. The same man was out there, and he was living among them. You can imagine the fear that took hold of those villages then. 2 girls, both 15, both taking ordinary paths home, both gone. The footpaths emptied. Doors that had never been locked were locked now. People looked at their neighbors, at the familiar faces in the pub and the post office, and wondered. Because whoever had done this was almost certainly local. He knew these lanes. He belonged here, and nobody knew who he was. Now, here the police believed they had a breakthrough. A local young man, 17 years old, named Richard Buckland, came to their attention. He worked near the area. He seemed to know things about the second crime scene, details that troubled the investigators. Under questioning, he confessed to the murder of Dawn Ashworth. To the detectives, exhausted and desperate to give these grieving families an answer, it must have felt like the end of a nightmare. They had their man, a confession in hand. But there was a problem, a stubborn, nagging problem. Richard Buckland would confess to the second killing. He would not confess to the first. And the police were sure, deep down, that both girls had been killed by the same person. Why would he admit to one and not the other? To resolve that question, the investigation turned to something entirely new. Something that had never before been used to solve a murder anywhere on Earth. Let us step back, just a little, and into a laboratory at the University of Leicester, only a short drive from those frightened villages. There worked a scientist named Alec Jeffreys. 2 years earlier, on the morning of the 10th of September, 1984, at 5 minutes past 9, he had been looking at an X-ray film from one of his experiments. On that film were patterns drawn from human DNA, the genetic material carried in every one of our cells. And in that moment, he saw something extraordinary. He could see how the patterns from members of one family were both alike and unalike. He realized, in a single flash of understanding, that these patterns were unique to each individual, as unique as a fingerprint and yet inherited, passed down through families. He called it DNA fingerprinting. It was one of those rare moments in science where a person glimpses something true that no one has ever seen before. He could not have known, that morning, where it would lead. The police came to Alec Jeffries and asked him to test the genetic material recovered from both crime scenes against the young man who had confessed. What the science revealed was startling, and it ran in two directions at once. First, it confirmed that the same man had indeed killed both Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth. The cases were joined, exactly as the detectives had feared. But second, and just as importantly, it showed that this man was not Richard Buckland. The 17-year-old who had confessed was innocent. The DNA simply did not match. Think about that for a moment. A young man had confessed to a murder he did not commit, perhaps frightened, perhaps confused, perhaps worn down by the pressure of questioning. Under the old way of doing things, he might well have been convicted. He might have spent his life in prison for a crime that was not his. Instead, this brand new science set him free. Richard Buckland became the first person in the history of the world to be cleared of a crime by DNA evidence. The very first exoneration of its kind. It is worth pausing on that, because we often think of DNA as a tool for catching the guilty. But its very first act, in this case, was to protect the innocent. And yet the real killer was still out there, somewhere among those familiar faces. So the police made a decision that was, at the time, almost unimaginable. If DNA could clear an innocent man, then perhaps DNA could find the guilty one. They would ask every local man of the right age to give a sample of blood voluntarily, so that it could be compared against the killer's genetic profile. Beginning in early 1987, they launched what became known as the world's first mass DNA screening. The men of the villages, mostly those between about 17 and 34 years of age, were asked to come forward. Over time, more than 5,000 men gave their blood. It was an enormous undertaking, painstaking and slow, sample after sample after sample. The local men called it, with a kind of grim humor, the blooding. One by one the samples were tested, and one by one the men were cleared. And the killer, it seemed, was not among them. Which raised an unsettling question. If every local man had given blood, and none of them matched, then how could the murderer have slipped through? The answer, when it finally came, did not come from a laboratory. It came from a conversation in a pub. Among the men who had been asked to give blood was a 30-something baker named Colin Pitchfork. He lived in Littlethorpe, in a house on a quiet close, with a wife and family. He had a past, convictions for indecent exposure, the kind of thing that, he feared, would make the police look closely at him. He did not want to give his blood. He did not want his name on that list. So he hatched a scheme. Pitchfork persuaded a younger man, a colleague from the bakery named Ian Kelly, who was 23, to take the blood test for him, to pretend to be Colin Pitchfork. To make the deception work, Pitchfork doctored a passport, removing his own photograph and replacing it with Kelly's, so that Kelly could present himself as Pitchfork when the time came. And he paid him. The sum was about £200. On the 29th of January, 1987, Ian Kelly walked in, gave a sample of his own blood under another man's name, and walked out. The sample, of course, came back clean. It was Kelly's blood, and Kelly had done nothing. And so Colin Pitchfork, the man the entire investigation was searching for, passed straight through the net the police had cast for him. He must have thought himself untouchable. But here is the quiet truth at the heart of so many of these stories. People talk. A secret shared is a secret that begins, slowly, to leak. Months later, On a Saturday lunchtime in August of 1987, Ian Kelly was sitting in a pub in Leicester, the Clarendon, talking with another colleague from the bakery. And he told them. He spoke about how he had taken the test for Pitchfork, how he had stood in and given his blood. Perhaps it felt like a clever story, a thing to boast about over a drink. But at a nearby table sat a woman named Jackie Fogg Ginn, another colleague, 28 years old. And she heard it. She heard every word. She sat with what she had heard for a long while. It was not an easy thing to carry or an easy thing to act upon. But eventually, in September, she went to the police and told them what she had overheard in the Clarendon that day. That single conversation, half heard over the noise of a pub, was the thread that unraveled everything. The police moved quickly now. On the 19th of September, 1987, they arrested Colin Pitchfork at his home on Haybarn Close in Littlethorpe. This time there would be no stand-in, no doctored passport. They took his own blood, under the authority of the court, and they tested it against the genetic profiles from both crime scenes. And the science, calm and certain, gave its answer. His blood matched. It matched the man who had killed Linda Mann in 1983. It matched the man who had killed Dawn Ashworth in 1986. There was no argument to be made against it, no confession to retract, no doubt to exploit. The pattern written in his cells placed him at both crimes beyond question. At Leicester Crown Court, Colin Pitchfork pleaded guilty. He admitted both murders and other offenses besides, including the attempt to pervert the course of justice through his scheme with Ian Kelly. On the 22nd of January, 1988, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term first set at 30 years. He became the first person anywhere in the world to be convicted of murder using DNA fingerprinting. The science that had been born on a quiet morning in a Leicester laboratory had now, for the first time, named a killer. And so the long fear over those 3 villages finally lifted. It is a strange and sobering thing to consider. 2 girls, both just 15, lost their lives along ordinary footpaths they had walked 100 times. An innocent young man very nearly paid for a crime he did not commit. And in the end, what brought the truth to light was a partnership of 2 very different things. The first was a brilliant idea, glimpsed on an X-ray film, that revealed each of us carries our own quiet signature inside. The second was something far older and simpler. A man who could not keep from talking, and another person who chose, in the end, to speak up. We like to think that science alone solves these cases, with its cold precision and its certainty. And the science here was extraordinary, the very first of its kind. But notice how much depended on something gentler and more human. On a woman in a pub who listened, and remembered, and carried what she knew until she found the courage to tell. The cleverest scheme in the world, the doctored passport, the paid stand-in, the careful avoidance, all of it undone by a conversation overheard on a quiet Saturday afternoon. So as you settle now towards sleep, let your thoughts rest there, in those 3 small villages with their footpaths and hedgerows, where the lights are coming on one by one in the windows, and the danger has passed, and the truth, at last, is known. Some secrets keep for a while, but very few keep forever. And often, in the end, it is the smallest of things, a word spoken aloud, a listener at the next table, that brings the whole quiet truth into the light. Rest easy now. Let the day go. Sleep well.